Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Compassion in Politics podcast. My name is Jennifer Nadel. It's lovely to have you all with us, and I'm incredibly excited to introduce our guest today, who is Darren McGarvey, also known as the Scottish rapper Loki. Darren is a musician, author, social commentator. He won the Orwell Prize for his 2018 book, Poverty Safari, Understanding the Anger of Britain's Underclass, and is a regular contributor to The Guardian, Independent, Scotsman and Daily Record. He's presented a number of TV shows. His latest, Darren McGarvey's Class Wars, explores how class affects our destinies, and it's currently available to view on BBC iPlayer. Darren, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. If I can start by asking you how you got here, what led you into political activism in the first place?
I grew up in the 80s and 90s and on the south side of Glasgow, where as a response to socio-economic decline that came with deindustrialisation, a lot of the social and cultural malaise that we associate with Thatcherism had begun to set in. And after, a period of years of urban dereliction, problems at various levels of governance, I think it was really the poll tax movement that spurred a generation of young activists into action. And this is always what happens, there's always a political overreach or some sort of excess which people are no longer prepared to tolerate, and this becomes the undoing of whatever the power structure is at that particular time. And so that began in Pollock, and I was just a child at that time, being carted around protests and public meetings with my grandmother, who was very active in the community. And so the discussion around social equality, politics, poverty and class, it was always in the air. And so I very much immersed in that environment. And so it became very natural to me.
And what spurred you on to continue with your activism?
Well, in the beginning, I was never part of an activist community. I didn't move like that. I operated independently for whatever reason. I'm sure other people in future might go back through my life and look at why that was. But my early forays into action were setting up local youth groups and theatre group when I myself was a young person. So I had already began to identify that one of the problems with the what you would call Blairism, I suppose, was that while more money was invested in communities and there were more initiatives to engage people from my kind of background, not a lot of thought had gone into the democratic aspect of that. What say did we have over what was going on? And how did you guard against our social mobility becoming contingent on being regarded as worthy by a university educated lefty? So I began to resist this, although I didn't understand all of the political context at the time. It was just intuitive to me that I spoke a certain way, presented myself a certain way. There was a certain emotional resonance which was regarded as unhelpful or not constructive. So I remember there was a article published in a local paper in Pollock, which depicted unfavourably people in the area. It was a kind of caricature of an alcoholic. And this was our local paper. And this was a feature of Blairism, the cultural prong of Blairism, which was media representation of working class people became, hideously disfigured from the reality. And so I remember writing a mock article to challenge this, in which I depicted very much what you would see the Daily Mash or News Thump do now, except it was a fully written article where the editor of that paper got sacked for doing that. And then what I did was I delivered copies, cycled around the community and delivered big piles of these to all the local community centres so that other people could see them. And I was just doing it to get back at him. You know, it was like a very personal thing. But subsequently, I realised it generated a lot of discussion in community settings. And also, it gave me a sense of confidence that despite my youth, I had a firm enough grasp of the dynamics of the community to make my presence felt and advocate on the behalf of others.
And when you wrote your book, Poverty Safari, for which you won the Orwell Prize, one of the things that you draw out in there is how many commentators and reformers don't actually have any real concept of how people live. Why do you think that is?
Well, this is just a basic issue of proximity. The closer you are to a particular phenomenon or event, as close as experiencing it, or as distant as observing it from the Houses of Parliament, then this really determines your capacity to truly understand and contend with that. And the further away from it you are, then your understanding is only as good as the advice that you're getting. And unfortunately, we haven't got to a point where we understand that and implement ways to bring in lived experience into policy analysis and formation. This is unusual because the creation of the welfare state and the formation of the Beveridge Report in part drew from hundreds of interviews that were conducted in the 1930s when the great and the good were interested in examining the long-term impact of unemployment. And so they went out to Britain to all of these communities that Orwell wrote about and basically surveyed experience at such a scale that regardless of what people said or didn't say, certain trends and social facts began to emerge from that, which then it shaped many of the reforms that we've seen with the creation of the welfare state, because there are specificities concerned with the poverty experience that you wouldn't be able to speculate to unless you went close to that community. So what lived experience at scale does is it guards against assumption-driven social policy, which always creates further social problems down the line. And just now we are in a phase of excess and assumption, which I think that the pandemic hopefully will draw a red line under.
How hopeful are you that the pandemic will lead to a change in direction? Because it's definitely created a pause, but do you think we are going to build back fairer?
There were some encouraging signs in the beginning, particularly the now infamous Emily Maitlis monologue on Newsnight. What that indicated to me was that there are influential figures within British media or the British establishment who diverge slightly from the prevailing sensibility at that level, a sensibility that I have experienced now because of the unconventional level of social mobility that I have enjoyed as a result of the book about the death of social mobility. So I think that indicated to me that within all our institutions, whether it be media, whether it be academia, education, or even capitalist institutions, there are a diversity of opinions and views, and there are always struggles going on within those institutions about how we deal with things like inequality. And I think what Emily Maitlis done that night was she sort of put her neck on the line, because she didn't do anything particularly controversial. That highly editorialized form of journalism has been Andrew Neil's bread and butter for decades.
But we don't have women doing that, do we?
Yes, absolutely. And certainly not calling out the power structure. It's okay to do it if you are blaming people for poverty or saying that addiction is a moral failing or targeting immigrants or whatever. But if you call out class inequality, this creates a big shock within institutions and within the public, and it's discussed for days. So that for me was an encouraging sign. I think that the big lessons from the pandemic have been, just go over this briefly. The first thing is that the minute that politicians talk in the rhetoric of community and encourage us to regard ourselves and our neighbours with the same level of care and compassion and respect, it's amazing how quickly the public mood can shift to one of adversarialism and acrimony to one of community spirit, with 1 million people signing up to become volunteers in the course of a few days. It also shows the power of politicians coming on and repeating a message every day, and how that can quickly shape attitudes and behaviour. When Boris Johnson or Nicola Sturgeon or whoever come on TV and tell us repeatedly, you can't see the virus, but it's there. And this is how it spreads, and this is what to be aware of. Imagine they did that every day in relation to things like homelessness or drug addiction. They came on TV and says, most people you see on the street begging are victims of serious childhood neglect and abuse. And every day they just reinforce that, just to change the temperature around the public mood where these things are concerned. The other thing is that clearly there are some problems that the government are prepared to follow the science on, but there are some problems that they're completely dismissive and ignorant of the science. So when we look at the impact of childhood development, of poverty, of abuse, neglect, all of it created in part by poverty, or if we look at the dynamics of abusive relationships, if we look at pretty much every issue that arises out of poverty, whether it be obesity, whether it be mental health, there is firm science around all of these things that if you were to reduce the level of inequality and create more opportunities, you would see significant progress in the medium and long term. But for some reason, applying the science is only applicable to a certain electorally lucrative, politically enfranchised, economically active section of the population, and all those other plebs, it doesn't really matter. So these are significant shifts in how a government normally behaves, and it'll be interesting to see how much of that continues post-pandemic.
You mentioned the welfare state earlier, and there is a lot of talk on the left that this might be a moment to look again at the social contract. What is your feeling about that? Is this a safe time to re-examine it, or should we just press on with and try and save what we've got?
Yeah, I think it needs thoroughly re-examined, because if you look very closely at welfare reform, what you see is the insidious role of American insurance companies, which were brought in as consultants as far back as 1992, when welfare reform was being floated by Major's government. And not just any old American insurance companies which have been taken to court countless times for engaging in illegal bad faith practices, which all evolve around denying legitimate insurance claims to people who have disabilities or have been injured and are unable to work. So this is an interesting aspect of welfare reform, which is understudied and is underreported. And so currently the DWP have been able to deflect with press releases which talk up the number of people who have had positive experiences of things like universal credit or personal independence payments. But as we know, the welfare state divides applicants into two broad categories, worthy and unworthy, and they both receive different types of treatment. They both are on the receiving end of different types of behaviourist techniques, which are supposed to shape attitudes to work, and in some cases instill fear and shame in applicants. This is particularly true of women who have suffered abuse at the hands of a male partner, who are then subjected to the overbearing surveillance, financial threats, and humiliation and shame from the state, which actually replicates the abuse that they are fleeing. And then they go into the family courts and they can't get legal aid because that's been withdrawn. So then abusive partners are able to come into public space and continue the onslaught of abuse. So there are all sorts of problems with the welfare system, but these insidious tentacles of corporate ideology, it has no place. It has no place in the welfare state. And if we were going to go back and look at it again, we would have to address some of those fundamentals first.
In addition to that corporate attitude, of course, we also have the way attitudes have shifted from the welfare state being there because there, but by the grace of God go I, any of us might need it at any time, to it being a place for scroungers, malingerers. I mean, the conditioning that we've had, benefit cheat, hotlines, and kind of, for me, the most insidious thing of all is telling us that if we help people, we're somehow encouraging dependency, as if holding your hand out to another is somehow colluding with the problem of poverty.
Yeah, it's fascinating also how many people who have held those attitudes for so long are first in line for these very generous checks that the government are sending out to people who are self-employed, as if somehow a crisis that befalls an over-mortgaged middle-class family is out of their hands and they require help. But a crisis that befalls a person who has no resources, very, very insecure social connections to sustain them, is somehow attributable to their poor decision making. I mean, if we were applying the notion of meritocracy and personal responsibility universally, then surely the government should be saying right now, go and sell your car, go and sell one of your cars if you're struggling. Why don't you sell your second home? What are you coming to the government for money for? Oh, your business is went down. Well, that's tough luck. You take the risk. You should have decided if you could afford to have a business before you had a business. And you know, the rules just apply. They apply wherever the great and the good want them to apply. And I think that's a thing I really examine quite closely in book 2. It's a lot of these fantasies that people have internalized over the years through Thatcherism to Blairism about social mobility and class doesn't exist and meritocracy and these comforting lullabies that explain for people why they just seem to fall upwards in life while other people can't even get up off the ground. There have been revealed as false. They've been revealed as akin to superstitions because there's so little evidence for them actually existing. The big benefit of having material resources and cultural capital, however, is that you always have a multiple choice option where basic social facts are concerned. And I'm pretty sure that some people's false belief systems will be extremely resilient to facts and scrutiny because of this crisis.
And that brings us really to class as well. How much of a role does class play in all of this?
Class as a lens to frame specific social trends that we see in childhood development, education, health, mental health, suicide, homelessness, unemployment, how much you earn. It remains the most useful framework for thinking about divergences between people from different social backgrounds. Now, I would be the first one to acknowledge that you can't apply a class analysis to every single situation that occurs. And I would also be the first to acknowledge, while I do engage in it from time to time, that class essentialism, i.e. assuming that all working class people are salt of the earth, or assuming that all middle class people are Guardian readers with massive fitted kitchens, is unhelpful. And actually, when you walk around with that kind of framing, you reduce the chance of having a constructive dialogue with people who will aggressively resist that sort of categorization. But in terms of just the basic understanding of class interests, the conflicts between different social classes, and how these are then expressed in legal systems, how they are expressed in political systems, And then the fallout from that culturally and socially, the class lens, the class analysis doesn't create social division, as is often argued by some. It very comprehensively describes what drives social division. And that is why, despite numerous attempts to flush it from public discourse, it has endured and persists, because eventually, if your house goes on fire and you are not allowed to use the word fire to describe what tore through the structure, eventually you're going to lose the ability to properly discern certain realities. And that's why this language always re-emerges. It emerges out of a need to describe something that happens.
What would you say the cause is? You said class is one way of a frame to understand it. What do you think the cause of poverty and social injustice?
I believe that, see, there's the big picture way of looking at it, and I guess in truth I oscillate between the two. The sort of centre ground liberals in the centre left and the centre right, they tend to always see the world in the large, in that kind of big sense of where we are in society just now is just another step in our social and economic evolution. And while there are deep-seated problems, look at all of the progress that we've seen. So they often turn to the increase in life expectancy, the decrease in child mortality, the eradication of absolute poverty, and these seem to be the key metrics that justify this current phase of capitalism with a little bit of social democracy. When in truth, if we look at those metrics now, they are either flatlining or have gone into decline. So if this was the justification for the status quo, then surely this is now the argument that there's a problem with the status quo. The class inequalities, they emerge because people who come from lower class backgrounds have a further distance to travel and more baggage to carry in order to ascend into influential positions in politics, in culture, in media, where they might be able to represent the class interests of people who come from that background. And if we look at a lot of the data around the class composition of the House of Commons, for example, we can see the almost complete eradication of working class voices. And anyone who does come from a working class background slowly has to develop a sense of the studied informality to conceal aspects of where they come from in order that they can become socially mobile. This is one of the great costs of social mobility to individuals. They have to renounce or conceal who they are and what they believe and what they find funny and what they think's boring, because they are moving in middle class spheres where there's an entirely different sensibility that prevails. So when that occurs, then people in positions of authority and power, they begin to conflate what works for them with what works for everyone else. This is kind of typified in Blair's "everyone just wants to be middle class." That's a very dangerous assumption. And so, you know, under his tenure, as well as a lot of the progress that we did see, we also created conditions where people became ashamed of being working class. And so people got into debt to move out of the working class. And then this created the illusion of social mobility, when actually we've got increased levels of debt, and a lot of people who think they're middle class, they're going to Aldi, buying their shopping and then putting it in a Marks and Spencer's bag before they go home. And so I think when you have people whose intuitions are about primarily, you know, what their interests are, and then assuming that that's everyone's interests, then our institutions will tend to discuss things in terms that exclude certain aspects of social reality. And, you know, you see that in everything from the Jeremy Kyle show, which is a strange media Stanford experiment. You see this in how news covers a lot of issues around poverty. And obviously you see this in political strategy, political behaviour and political policy.
I was interested in the first episode of Class Wars that social mobility, we have the worst rate of social mobility in the whole of Western Europe.
Yeah.
How do you account for that?
it's interesting because I think that Thatcher accelerated deindustrialization at a pace which was so aggressive that sufficient time hadn't been given to understand what happens when you remove the employment opportunities and the economic heart of a community. I mean, most communities are situated around something that generates jobs or opportunities or a sense of shared identity. And so I'm not making the argument that perhaps too much employment was dependent on inefficient and environmentally destructive industries. But we could have been a lot more socially intelligent about how we embarked on this transition. All Thatcher assumed was that the free market would come in and liberate everyone, and eventually, through the special keen intuitions of a free market, which operates along the amoral lines of supply and demand, would somehow liberate people from the cumbersome, overbearing state dependency that characterized their experience. In essence, though, what did happen was we replaced jobs with bookies and pubs and fast food because the free market detected this is what people want. It didn't understand that people wanted those things because they help reduce feelings of stress. They become self-insistent compulsions, alcohol, drugs, gambling, and all of these things. And so really that became an aspect of Thatcher's legacy. Of course, there were countless other people who experienced social mobility as a result of the massive state interventions of a Conservative party that apparently believes in small state. Where the Conservative Party believes in the state is when it's intervening in the interests of the corporate classes, and when it's intervening in the interests of landlords, and when it's intervening in the interests of homeowners and people who own grand estates and landowners. Their state interventions absolutely essential to protect those interests. And when you're protecting those interests, what you're doing is you're shoveling a lot of shit on the people who don't own anything. And that, for me, it brings us in part to where we are today. And not only that, but the fact that we now have a political class which has risen not based on merit, not based on merit the way that you and I would think about it. You're seeing ministers who were put in place because of their political utility to a leader, and then thrown into jobs for which they had no qualification, and they're taught how to do that job by permanent secretaries whose understanding of the issues is also questionable. So every single layer there, you see how
they're often moved on just as soon as they've begun to get a grasp.
Yeah, exactly. And they're writing the legislation for the private interests who are then they're then going to be parachuted into that corporate world later. And there's nothing really to guard against that. It's interesting how that's not seen as socially unacceptable, but being homeless is. It's strange, isn't it? I mean, imagine you inverted those two things, and people had the same disdain and disgust for what just now is regarded as conventional and proper as they do for people who are begging on the street and dying on the street.
I mean, it is extraordinary. Our mission at Compassion in Politics is to bring those issues that just seem to have become accepted, normalized almost, that people are lying outside in the street in freezing temperatures, back into the public gaze, because we have to judge a society by things like hunger and homelessness. And the fact that we have a rising rate of infant mortality here is just shocking. We're alone in Europe with having a rising rate of infant mortality.
Yeah.
What do you think?
The political class will cite every single possible reason and excuse for that, except themselves. And this is one of the problems with this idea of political centrism, which, an expression of it is the kind of middle class paternalism that's encapsulated in phrases like, oh, the adults in the room, when they see Tony Blair and Gordon Brown and they get all misty eyed and they think, those were the good old days when the adults were in the room. because they identify with those kind of figures. And so you now have a situation where, despite the fact that the Overton window of the centre ground has moved to the right considerably, you still have a significant stranglehold of people who would consider themselves in that Blairist mould, in our institutions, in the civil service, in Whitehall, in media. And so everything that occurs in society is still filtered and to some extent through that lens, which means that centrism, as a result of being in the centre, it doesn't detect the forces that shape politics and culture that move in from the margins of society. So this is why centrists were really caught off guard with Brexit. They didn't understand the anger that was felt on the margins of society, anger that people like Nigel Farage did understand and very, and weaponized to disastrous political effect in so many ways. Centrists were inviting Steve Bannon into the BBC because they thought he's an interesting character. And then you get people on the left getting called loonies for saying, no, this guy's a fascist. This guy's a fascist. And by the time things twig in the centre ground, it's often too late. The damage is done. But centrists possess the cultural capital to generate myths for themselves about why certain things are happening. And that's why this centrist refrain of getting the band back together, and all we need is centrism for the 21st century, and it's really delusional, because if you actually look at the material output of centrism, it's turned the state into a kind of cleaner that mops up the mess of corporations that are handed blank checks to facilitate organised human life. So if you look at the environment, if you look at mental health, if you look at relationships, if you look at the family, all of these different aspects of our society, they have been rendered unrecognisable by the influence of corporate forces for which no risk assessments were performed before we said, you come in and manage welfare, you come in and manage the community, you come in and manage the charity. And so the state really just exists to mop that up, whether it's through half-hearted welfare policies, or whether it's making interventions to limit the amount of food that people can buy at one time, or the amount of alcohol, or limitations on gambling. It's the government, the state, trying to put like makeshift safety valves on things 20 years after the fact. And I see that is really the legacy of Blairism and of centrism. They act intuitively in favour of the corporate way of doing things, and this is always at the cost of the wider society.
And you talked about that anger that was given an outlet. I think I've read about you describing it as like giving people who haven't been heard the microphone. Brexit gave them the microphone. How are we going to address this anger as we go forward? Because it hasn't dissipated, it's still there. It just may not centre on Brexit anymore, but it's still bubbling. We can feel it.
The anger's there. What's interesting, and my research on this is it's at the forefront of my mind now as I'm working on this book. And so I analyse the topic of immigration and explore what is it that the left did wrong in terms of being unable to capitalise on anger in working class communities about long-standing inequalities that actually preceded our membership of the European Union. And it was because of this topic of immigration which brings into tension two important principles on the left, which is anti-racism and working class struggle. But actually, if you look at a lot of the attitude surveys at the time, you find that there is significant immigration concern within migrant populations. There's significant immigration concern among different ethnic groups. And while the reasons for those concerns differ in specific ways from white British immigration concerns, they arise from the same well of legitimate anger created by long-standing social inequalities, local authority mismanagement, corruption at various levels of governance, disastrous housing policy, disastrous town planning. If you look at a place like Thanet, which is a beautiful part of the country, historically significant. It used to be an island, you know, it's just miles and miles of seafront. And then you go to these places and you see that since the kind of onset of mass air travel, these places have been falling into decline for half a century. So while obviously you've got some skillful political operators have got in there with the UKIP adverts and said this is because of the refugee crisis, or this is because of the European Union, in actual fact, a class analysis would and sufficient engagement with immigration concern to make sure you're separating out the racism and xenophobia from legitimate concerns about how a process is managed and the impact it has on a community, then this would have been the prime real estate from which the left could have based some kind of resurgence. Instead, they saw Corbynism, we saw Corbynism as a kind of shortcut through all that. So we thought Corbyn will unite the left. All this arguing about identity politics and cultural war will all shut up just now because he might win. But of course, Corbyn was never going to get any Downing Street without making concessions to the Murdoch press and special interests. And because he didn't do that, he didn't get in. And so now the left is kind of out in the wilderness. You know, that's just one example, but how an inability on the part of the political establishment to both prescribe adequate solutions to social problems and interpret the toxic effects of their bad solutions is I would say the most significant factor in the social degeneration of the United Kingdom. But like I said earlier, those people are so privileged that they never have to contend with their own incompetence
and their own consequences.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about the left as being out in the wilderness, and of course one of the conversations that's bubbling around on the left at the moment is progressive patriotism. You know, can we win back UKIP voters? What's your feeling about the notion of progressive patriotism?
It's just another form of identity politics, really. And I understand why some would think that it was a necessary adjustment to make to acknowledge how society has shifted. But I think history shows us that building a social consciousness or social cohesion or a shared identity around a mythical conception of what Britain is in the world is inherently unstable and potentially radioactive, because eventually the truth comes to light and people can't deal with it. And so then they go and they want to guard statues, or other people want to tear them down. And this creates all of these sidebar issues to the central problem, which in my view is the class inequality, which is affecting people of all ethnicities. Obviously, people experience compounding effects if they are part of an ethnic minority group, or they are disabled, or they are female. But unfortunately, these identity issues, sometimes they're kind of pitched by politicians or by, you know, Costa Coffee or whoever wants to create the illusion that a serious social change is occurring, and that allows the re-entrenchment of the class inequalities that lead to the frustration in the first place. I would like to see you know, a mature, emotionally intelligent politician come on television and say the history of Britain is complex. What Britain entails in the world is complex, and not shy away from it. You know, because I think they might lose some people. They might lose some people who say, no, I'm not going to tolerate any of this nuance. But the amount of people that would be endeared to that attempt to really just be honest about the fact that every country that has created an empire has that tension between what actually happened and what we like to think happened. And Britain's no different from any other empire in that regard. So I don't see it as some big shameful thing to admit. It's just about accepting it.
But we live in an age of absolutes, don't we? And the idea of nuance, the idea of things being a mixture and a complex mess rather than something that's neatly defined is difficult.
It's difficult, especially when most of us now are conflating reality with what's happening on social media. And this is one of the great things about getting around the country before all this kicked off. Whether you're talking about immigration, whether you're talking about identity politics, whether you're talking about the left, whether you're talking about Tories, or whether you're talking about centrism, when you get out there and actually speak to people who have views or experiences or advocate certain positions in all of these areas, you realise that there's a vast distance between a conception that you hold in your mind, which is usually ascribed one character, one intent, and creates one output. And then you deal with the reality, which is people are complicated. People arrive at political views and positions based on experiences that are to some extent unknowable. And when you're running around with a very fixed conception of what's going on, based on these caricatures, which are often quite uncharitable, then not only do you get it wrong in terms of what drives a lot of people, but you then cultivate within yourself this sense of anxiety and fear about all of these enemies within your midst who are trying to dismantle what's important to you, whether that be Tories who are frightened that gay people are dismantling the institutional family, or whether that be working class people thinking that the myth of the British state is being dismantled by loony lefties, and on it goes. The only thing you can do to guard against this, because you can't depend on political figures to treat it with sufficient intelligence and nuance, is to push yourself to go out into social situations where you will experience the reality, read publications and books that aren't necessarily always just looking at the world from the perspective that seems most comfortable to you. And if you do that, then you guard against that tribal impulse, which I think is present in all of us.
Now we've got a lot of people wanting to ask questions. Just one last question before we go to questions from our audience. It's the budget tomorrow. If you were in number 11 Downing Street, if you were the Chancellor, what are the main things you would do?
Wow. I would raise tax on corporations, close all the loopholes that they can use to stop paying it. Again, I'm not in favour of this kind of essentialism where you ascribe a specific character to people or institutions. Corporations are doing what they're legally mandated to do by government, which is increase market share, growth quarterly, and profits for shareholders. That's what a corporation is designed to do. So we need to give it a new mandate and say you have a social responsibility to the environment and to the public purse. And where you are seen to be trying to shirk or evade that responsibility, and we catch you, you'll have a significant penalty to pay. A few years ago, Bernie Sanders put forward a very politically intelligent piece of legislation called the Bezos Act, right? And this was basically, it would set a precedent in America because it would charge corporations 100% of the cost of subsidizing low wages through the welfare state. So if an Amazon worker or a Walmart worker or a McDonald's worker was on $1,000 of food stamps, McDonald's, Walmart and Amazon would have to foot the bill. And so this would create new incentives, economic incentives to pay people so that they can survive and so they can thrive. And it was shouted down, it was shouted down by his own party, the centrists, who are intuitive to the needs of the corporate interests. I think that soon we're going to see some of the irreversible effects of this kind of capitalism on steroids. I like going to shops. I like aspects of capitalism. I don't think any serious person would deny that there are aspects of it which are beneficial or have been beneficial, and there are principles contained within it that are useful. But there's just so many contradictions within it at this point, and it creates as much poverty as it does wealth. And this issue of wealth accumulation through tax avoidance and evasion is so serious that I would be upping tax on them quite considerably.
Thanks. And now we've got some really great questions coming in from the audience. I'll pick a couple out. Leslie Baker's asked, do you think the myth of meritocracy has damaged the working class?
Absolutely, it's damaged everyone, because if you look at some of the recent data that was published by the London School of Economics around people's conceptions of class, particularly those who are actually middle class, but believe that they're from the working class, or say that they're from the working class, the analysis also shows something that a lot of us would have probably intuitively felt, which was that a lot of people, out of a sense of embarrassment of the privilege that they've enjoyed, and a sense of the inequality that is occurring, they reach deep into their past for evidence of working class heritage. So they'll say things like, I was the first person in my family to go to university, or I'm working class because my great granddad spoke to a miner once. Do you know what I mean? And these are very tenuous connections to working class experiences. But what this is also a result of the myth of meritocracy, because people feel a lot of social pressure to create an internal narrative that says that they got where they are because they're worthy, and not the truth, which is most of us get where we are because of luck and help that we get, and certain social supports that are available, and then also whatever we're bringing to the table. So the meritocracy was really, it was just it was a term that was created as a satire. It wasn't meant to be taken seriously. It was Toby Young's dad who came up with it as a writer in the 50s. And he wrote this book that was a kind of satirization of this idea of creating a society based on merit, and it didn't end well. But it's a lie. It's a comforting lullaby. And often the people who are most aggressively parroting it are the most unworthy people of the positions that they've achieved in society. And I only have to look at 10 Downing Street for a shining example of where powerful connections and being moneyed and landed the day that you're born helps a great deal.
Now, Josie Hinton has asked two great questions. What key reforms to the welfare state would you like to see?
Wow.
Small question there.
Well, one of the things welfare reform done was it removed the need for opinions of medical professionals and reaching decisions about whether welfare was allocated, the level of welfare conditionality and compliance applied. So it's people who have no medical experience who are making decisions based on quotas, based on, so even now, algorithms. You've got local authorities now using algorithms to assess certain aspects of how welfare is distributed. This is history will show this to be a really dark period in our social history. What has occurred in the welfare state, the number of deaths. You know, there is data out there that shows that nearly half of all people with disabilities have been subjected to this new regime of attempted suicide. And these are findings that are not as reported as readily in the media yet, because I suspect that they would have significant far-reaching consequences. And it's a bit like during the war. You know, during the war, the media has a bit of a role to play when we're at war. You know, you see it just now because we're in the pandemic. The media has to rein in the scrutiny a little bit because of the bigger picture. And unfortunately, we haven't quite got to the level where the public understands the problems with welfare. But I would be looking at all of that stuff.
And what could be done to incorporate lived experience into policy formulation? You know, you identified that as a real problem. What can we do about it?
We just do what we did do. We send people out into the world and we say, don't come back till you know something. Don't come back till you find out something new. Go out into society and actually talk to people about what 0 hours contracts does. Go out and talk to people about what, you know, how advertising affects their behaviour. Go out and talk to people about whatever problem you're trying to deal with. If you survey experience at a sufficient scale, you're going to find something significant about the emergent behaviours, attitudes and experiences of a specific kind of policy or a specific economic shift in emphasis. It's just that it requires humility on behalf of the political classes to recognise that they don't know everything, and neither do their spivs in Whitehall. But also it requires a determination to see social change over the long term and not within the kind of the constraints of an electoral cycle, which is primarily what all political policy now is formulated in.
A lovely question here from an anonymous attendee. Would you be willing to become a politician to breach these important, or I don't know whether breach is the right word. Will you be an MP? Will you change?
I don't think so. I'm already uncomfortable with the level of scrutiny that I receive now as a moderately well-known public figure, and especially as one who's been quite transparent about aspects of my life in the past and present. So I would be frightened really to put myself in a position where I would come under such intense scrutiny that it would be detrimental for me or my family, and that's even at a low entry level politics. You know, if I was to announce I was standing for a councillor or an MP tomorrow in Scotland, there would be maybe a bit more interest in that than most people who get into politics. But also, I understand that while there is a place for politics in the traditional professional sense, that also the history shows us that social change is driven from outside politics. And then what politicians do is they either attempt to pacify that change or water it down or implement it in recognition that they have no choice and that the people have spoken. So in Britain, welfare, civil rights, women's rights, LGBT equality, housing rights, 40-hour week, lunch breaks, all of these things that a lot of middle class people who think the left are just loonies take for granted now, were fought for by working class people, because the two advantages working class people have is that they have the strength in numbers, and also they're often put into positions where they have nothing to lose, and then that's when it's kind of balls to the wall, for want of a better phrase. And I recognise that getting into traditional politics, professional politics, it pulls you away from that. So it's harder to drive change in that sense, and I think that's where the real change comes from.
One last question. What does the word hope mean to you?
I guess in this sense, I'm not as pessimistic as a lot of the people that I read about society and the decline of society. Obviously, there are certain aspects like the climate destruction and the potential for nuclear war and all these things, which are very serious, and no amount of hoping will change these things. That's where we need action. But I do believe, and maybe it's naive of me, I do believe in the fundamental goodness of all people, whatever politics they hold, whatever views they've espoused, or whatever their behaviour in their life in the past. I think and that when I'm not in that kind of angry and urgent state, which I think is necessary from time to time, I'm always trying to get back to that place where even when I really disagree with someone and probably don't like them much, I know that in their life they're probably loved by people and they've probably done good for people. And I could cite many examples of people who would be dismissed without thought on social media as a result of a political opinion that they hold, who are very valued members of their community and very respected people who have contributed a lot. So I would say that hope for me is the hope to be able to always find my way back to that fundamental conception of humanity.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was a really inspiring, motivating conversation, and thanks to all who joined us. Take care, and thanks for being with us.
Thanks, guys.
This podcast was brought to you by the think tank Compassion in Politics. Our podcasts are part of the Real Agenda Network and they are recorded live. Our next one on Tuesday the 9th of March will be with the broadcaster and author Gavin Esler, who'll be talking about his latest book, How Britain Ends, as well as how we might start getting some more compassion into journalism. If you'd like to join us live for that event or receive news about other events, sign up to our newsletter by going to compassioninpolitics.com, and you can sign up to receive future podcasts from us on your favourite podcast provider. Thanks so much for joining us, and we look forward to being back with you again soon.